Believe it or not, The Lorax was Dr. Seuss's 36th story out of 51. And even though there wasn't an official work from Dr. Seuss himself about where the inspiration came from, speculation came from a vacation he took to Kenya in 1970. Or The Lorax also tackling the theme of deforestation in tandem with that author fighting his own battle to keep a suburban development project from clearing the eucalyptus trees around his La Jolla, California home. He had hoped to pen a children's book that would support the so-called environmental protection movement, but according to Seuss' biographer and Dartmouth College American Literature professor Donald Pease, the famed author had feared that all of his previous efforts sounded too preachy. With the published date of 1971, this story was about deforestation, even though there is no definitive answer on what inspired the story. We do have something that inspired the Lorax himself, and that is the mustachioed Paytas monkey. Based on a 2007 online poll, the National Education Association listed the Lorax as one of its teachers' top 100 books for children. And of course, why wouldn't it? Dr. Seuss is very familiar to us, and even kids. It's not just stories, but real lessons that are able to be taught to all of us if we read into it more. Today I will be going through both stories and figuring out how Illumination was able to stretch out this story, and what went bad in the process. So follow along with me and see just how badly Illumination messed up with a great Dr. Seuss story. Before we get into the actual story of the Lorax, I want to talk about Illumination themselves. Now I did speak on this previously with my last videos, so I will have that link down below if you want to see what I had to say about that one. Overall, the reviews on this film pointed to Illumination and how they changed the story. Delving deep into the behind-the-scenes moments, it sounds like they already had trouble with turning the 64-page story
creative license, because what works on the page of a book isn't necessarily going to work really well in the medium of film.
Now, we didn't know whether or not we could truly do justice to this story until we had translated that very simple design of the Lorax into a 3D character, and we could see that the spirit of his drawing was living and breathing in that dimensional character.
Of course, they were able to bring these photogenic characters to life in a 3D setting, but this was borderline the only reason for their success. It's much more than the beauty of the characters and the setting. If we look back at the previous films that Illumination had made before this, it was Despicable Me and Hop, with only one of those being successful. The overall goal of the company is, quote, infusing joy and discovery into every character, world, and story.
The truffula trees were a fun experiment in the sense that we had to find a cool shape, and we used some of the shapes from the book, and so it has the flavor of the illustration, but it's really its own thing because it's got, you know, all the fur and the hair on it, and that took quite a bit of time to sort of get the perfect look for these trees, so they look very appealing.
It's easy to do with this Dr. Seuss story, implementing a lesson, bringing already created characters into a 3D setting, and including catchy songs. All these aspects worked for them in terms of their version of the Lorax, but was it the only things? Well, let's get into the first animated version. If we look at this first, and yes, this was created right after the publication of the book, so it is unedited. The street of the lifted Lorax is where we are set in the aftermath of the forest being cut down. We get a flashback of how the forest and the green grass and the truffula trees, the Onceler chopped the trees one by one to knit. The story is straightforward. The Onceler chops one by one and asks the help of his family to extend the sales of what he sells. The Lorax, on the other hand, desperately is trying to get it to stop. Before you know it, there's a giant company being run in the middle of the forest. I do want to point out one thing. There are songs within the shorter version as well. One that is explaining the use of the needs, windshield wipers, shirts, sweaters, and even soup to help you be healthier. Anything you can think of to get people to buy it. The problem begins when the animals must evacuate as there is no food left for them. I noticed that the Onceler had a conversation with himself about if what he was doing was really wrong, but ultimately continues on with his neat business. At the end, the last tree is used and the machine stops. Then consumers start to leave. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing's going to get better. It's not. This is the quote that is taught in the end, giving the last seed and closing his shutters. When we look to the movie with a runtime of 86 minutes, I really wanted to look back and see just what other information they added into this, considering the real story is compacted into 25 minutes. A lot of fans were upset that there was so much more unnecessary information. The Lorax standing in front of a red curtain like this is some play introducing the story was interesting. In the real story, we never got to see the people who live in the town, all the people who brought the Thneed products. Aside from the music music, this is exactly what Dr. Seuss didn't want. He wanted an environmental message, however not too preachy or up in your face. As we are introduced to this town, it makes sense that they live like this. Knowing what trees and wildlife is, they just make everything artificially. We then are introduced to O'Hare, a new villain created out of thin air, about a man selling quote-unquote fresh air to the town. Of course, this is not the original story. Thneedville becomes the name of the town as it actually makes sense as to what was originally sold to them, Thneeds. The fabric that was created to be anything that was needed for the consumer. However, when you think of a whole town being called what it was sold and made out of, artificial, well, everything doesn't really mix well. Ted represents the boy we saw walking around the forest and finding the Lorax and Onceler. Of course, with most animated movies, there's got to be a love interest, and more of a reason to get to see a real tree. Ted's intention is he wants to do this only for the girl. Again, would make Seuss himself very disappointed. Because all these people were fixated on his life, they had no idea what was on the outside of it. And Ted was told of the Onceler by Grammy, so this takes place after all trees were already cut down, which is the same time as the book. So what they added was the village, this lifestyle, O'Hare, and a love interest that gave Ted a reason to go looking for the trees. After we get to hear the first half of the story, we get more unnecessariness of love interest, Audrey. O'Hare becomes the villain in the story when his business is being threatened by Ted's interest in trees, but again, not for the right reasons. The Onceler at one point made a promise to not cut down any more trees, then obviously breaking that promise later. So Illumination not only added more things into the storyline, but changed the overall story. I do want to include an interesting moment in this scene though, when the Lorax saved the Onceler's life even after he was trying to get rid of him. All the Lorax cared about was the animals and the trees and the forest and their safety, so this contradicts the Lorax's intentions. It comes down to the point where the Thneed becomes successful and popular to the point where the entire town that the Onceler was originally trying to sell to comes singing up the hill in the forest, so we get to see the aftermath and potentially what could have happened even after the destruction. The musical number montage represents his growing business over time and the reality of what the Onceler is doing. The extension of the story comes from O'Hare and what he comes up with after the last truffula tree is cut and the Onceler is out of business with no product. At the very least, Illumination did make sure to include what really mattered.
Because unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not.
The ending concludes with O'Hare chasing the seed and attempting to retrieve, of course doing so successfully, and convincing the town that trees are not a bad thing. The one thing I can't wrap my head around is the family with the glowing sun. In the beginning they were just like, yeah, he's glowing, it's fine. Then all of a sudden realizing it's not.
Just went swimming and now I glow.
My name is Dan.
And my name's Rose.
Our son Wesley kinda glows. And that's not good.
Animals start to come back as well as the Lorax now that the forest is in good standings. The original book is the same as the first animated version of the story. They're reminiscing of how well the forest and truffula trees grew until a greedy businessman took it all for granted as something he could make profit out of. But I'm really wondering what your thoughts are on this and what else you think Illumination got wrong about this film. As always, thank you for watching. Make sure you subscribe so you never miss another upload, and I'll see you all in the next one.